Hola, buenos dias. Unfortunately, that is the full extent of my Spanish, so I will be delivering in English this morning and trying to go slowly for the translators upstairs. But thank you very much for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to visit this part of the country. I want to talk today about the role of landscape in reimagining and making cities, both within the context of the continuing and increasing need for public open spaces in cities around the world, and especially against the backdrop of climate change and biodiversity loss, whose effects are intensifying day by day, year by year. Landscape green infrastructure designed ecological systems can clean air, soil, and water, can mitigate flooding, can reduce urban heat, can restore functioning urban habitat, and can nourish the human soul. Resilient landscapes, those that can shift and adapt with changing urban and environmental conditions, can be appropriated to restructure existing cities, to remediate and revitalize the infrastructural excesses of times past, and can form a new center point for healthy bodies and sharp minds, for social interaction and civic discourse, and sometimes just for pure fun. Starting in the 90s and early 2000s, I was part of a movement formulating, testing, and applying concepts of landscape urbanism, whereby landscape and ecologically based systems could be infused into city-making efforts. This work was rooted in late 20th century ideas of ecology, characterized by dynamic systems that were open to interactions across small and large scales, and that could change and adapt over time. Rather than starting the project of city making with just buildings and streets, we posited that cities could be built around natural or reconstituted environmental systems and dynamics, river corridors and floodplains, for instance, or, in the case of Galveston, Texas, pictured here, coastal hydrologies and marine ecologies. What you're seeing in this image are flood projections from sea level rise and the course of numerous hurricanes that have hit this island over the decades. The idea here was that cities formed or reformulated in these ways could offer richer and more fecund relationships with the broader environment as directly organized by and experienced through a dynamic public realm. Now, in many ways, these ideas were not so different than Frederick Law Olmsted's proposals for urban park systems in the late 19th century in the US. Here in the Emerald Necklace in Boston, for instance, Olmsted's park systems function for recreation, for respite, and for habitat, but also for flood control and as new forms of urban mobility and infrastructure vis-a-vis parkways and tree-lined streets and public squares, and also as frameworks for entirely new neighborhoods. In this way, these landscape-based park systems were green city building initiatives. Early on at Stas, we explored these ideas in various projects. In Detroit, a city that had experienced massive population loss and extensive vacancy, we drew on the emergent successional nature of landscape and a wide range of back to the land, urban cultivation, arts and culture, and food culture initiatives in order to rethink the ways in which the city might be organized around vibrant green systems, landscape systems, green infrastructure, and new forms of green urbanism that foregrounded productive and functional landscapes and new open spaces at the heart of new neighborhood types. And we started asking provocative questions. How might early experiments with dynamic stormwater and river flooding and giving back space in the city to water and to restored urban ecologies and habitat as imagined here in Milwaukee in the upper Midwest of the US. How might a project like this inform proposals, much larger scale proposals, for high-density urban neighborhoods on the lakefront in Toronto, built around the logics and dynamics of a reconstituted mouth of the Don River? How might demonstrations of rethinking stormwater management as vibrant, rich, and luxurious water gardens that bring sustainability to life, as proposed here at a new central campus space at the University of Michigan? How might a project like this inform proposals for mid and high-rise neighborhoods built around the stormwater waste of the city of Dallas, Texas, newly remade as water gardens and life-giving urban forests that offer biodiversity and direct contact with nature in the heart of the dense city? And how might speculations of the ways in which large-scale hydrologic systems could be used as a basis for restructuring and revitalizing the center of Green Bay, Wisconsin, organizing both new open space and new mixed-use development around a civic riverfront designed both for people and for flooding? How could projects like this inform proposals at larger scales in Galveston, Texas, for instance, that are designed to integrate floodable and adaptive landscape that revitalize individual neighborhoods and opportunities for experiencing regenerative new open spaces across the island? Landscape urbanism also proposes that the infrastructure and leftover sites of decades past can be reimagined as vital social, cultural, and environmental spaces that bring new life to the city. In St. Louis, a connective 20-mile system of greenways and new urban landscapes that break down barriers constructed by 20th century roadway and freeway infrastructure and reimagine underutilized spaces as the center of community life. At Harvard University, a new public landscape atop a roadway tunnel that creates a new center of social life on campus, bringing together the academic community with residents, workers, and visitors who pass through the space on a daily basis. In North Adams, a former industrial community in northwest Massachusetts, a proposal for removing a highway overpass constructed in the 1950s and restitching the downtown and a vibrant contemporary arts museum to the Hoosick River, to new open spaces, and to new housing. In Boston, an ongoing initiative for restitching the Chinatown community ripped apart by the construction of multiple interstate highways, with new opportunities for open space, affordable housing, and community amenities over a busy freeway, active rail lines, and a subway. And in Cambridge, a unique urban forestry demonstration project that revitalizes one of a series of leftover and underutilized spaces in a part of the city with limited access to open space, a low percentage of tree canopy, and an intense urban heat island effect, where growth, succession, and adaptation is at the heart of the proposal here. You begin to see an animation that talks about not just tree growth, but trees outcompeting with one another to see which of these trees are best suited to that site over time. This is an experimental project. It's a 1-acre site where we planted 400 new trees, 25 new tree species, and the whole idea here was a form of controlled natural succession. How is it that we overplant initially in order to allow the trees themselves to tell us which ones are best suited to the site. To do this, you need a municipal authority and a partner that's willing to do careful operations and maintenance after the fact in order to ensure this kind of project's success. It's a project that also creates a barrier to busy roads, cleaning air and water. It reestablishes biodiversity in the urban canopy. Here you're seeing sequences of images from 1 year after planting to 3 years after planting. It's a project that creates a new community space for people inside the forest to directly experience the benefits of this adaptive urban forest to individual and collective health and well-being, including increased shade and reduced heat. It also brings opportunities for interacting with nature and with each other in the heart of the city. So this is a project that will continue to grow and evolve radically over time. These days, those same core ideologies of landscape urbanism are evolving to take on both the effects of climate change and new social agendas. Here we can talk about the increasing intensity and frequency of storms, hurricanes, and the flooding and wind damage that comes with them. River flooding and sea level rise projected to increase over time. In other places, we're talking about drought and water shortages, loss of biodiversity, increasing intensities of urban wildfire, rising heat levels exacerbated by hard surfaces and lack of tree canopy in cities, and clear evidence that the most socially vulnerable and lowest income among us experience the effects of climate change more directly and more intensely. Given these challenges, we need to think differently as we design cities and new urban spaces, using characteristics of resilient landscapes as starting points, moving from hard to soft systems, from an understanding of the world as static to one as dynamic and ever-changing, from singular to multi-layered, multifunctional systems and spaces, and from a mindset of working against or resisting environmental forces to one about working with and adapting to them. This video of our proposal for an old industrial power plant on the port in Boston, a site being reimagined with a public waterfront, new housing and community commercial amenities, and workspace captures the essence of many of these ideas. A multifunctional urban space, flood protection, public access, community building, increasing urban canopy, economic development, all built around a landscape framework and adaptive thinking. Now, with all that as a starting point, I'd like to go into detail on 3 more recent projects that have consumed our interest, and that in some ways point to projects or problems that are similar to those being addressed here in the Port Redevelopment Initiative. The first one is in the Southern Caribbean at Arnos Vale, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This is a project that reimagines a 150-acre abandoned airport on the island of St. Vincent, envisioning a thriving new, resilient urban district that embraces its tropical waterfront setting. The goal here is to create a flourishing, sustainable urban environment that prioritizes community, open spaces, and climate resilience. Here you have an image of the existing site. Low-lying land, flooding from the hills above, which are off to the right of the airport in this instance. Flooding from an eroding river on the south side of the airport, vulnerable to rising seas and storm surge at the end of the runway, and already active with a number of existing sports facilities. Yet the desire here is to create new forms of resilient and active landscape and neighborhoods and city building, retaining the active sport, even expanding it, and also keeping a few key heritage buildings that dot the site. The framework of this plan is organized around landscape systems, with the adaptation of the central runway as the central open space. And so the runway here is converted to this long central open space. The hills from above are channeled into green fingers that irrigate an urban canal on the north side that prevents flooding from the hills into the center. This is the flooding river on the south, which is remade in order to flood and to layer in people. This is the expanded sports facility, new cultural facilities, new recreational facilities, and a vibrant series of new neighborhoods lining the old runway. These are the diagrams that inform the plan. And so again, rather than starting with buildings and streets, we started with the bigger landscape. We started with these. So here you can see the waterways, water coming down from the hillsides, being captured in a series of canals along this edge. This is the flooding Wawaruru River here, and then the coastline here that's being adapted in order to protect against storm surge. You can also see in this diagram how those drainage ways are converted into green fingers and a green boulevard, that the river becomes a bikeway and greenway that then connects into the athletic fields, that the whole waterfront becomes reconstituted as a dynamic social and environmental space, a real key point along the waterfront, and that the old runway itself is then organized as a series of landscapes. This is what it means to start a big development project with landscape systems and then to wrap the building systems and neighborhoods around them. So this is an image of the Northern Canal. Notice high water and flood stage, low water down here. These are designed to fluctuate according to seasonal variations in flow. This is the new riverfront, that eroding river that's been stabilized on the one hand, revegetated to increase functionality and biodiversity, and then also integrated with pedestrian ways and bicycle ways, so it's opened up as a key piece of new open space. And then the waterfront itself, buffered from some of the wave action, an expanded mangrove area that's cleaning water, adding life and sustainability, and then a series of terraces and walkways that make this a truly public destination waterfront, really open to residents of the entire island and visitors that come here. These landscape networks then frame diverse building typologies organized around the former runway, including new types of housing, live-work development, retail business zones, cultural and recreational amenities, and tourism facilities. So it's being built up for residents who exist, but also to invite new people in. Central to the vision is the transformation of the former airstrip itself into a multifunctional central park, creating a vibrant destination for residents, workers, and visitors alike, with a linear organization that speaks to its history. Open space amenities here are tailored to the needs of existing residents from surrounding neighborhoods and from Kingstown, the capital, with extensive shade, misting fountains, cooling stations, and active public spaces in order to make this place habitable even during the hottest times of day. In all these ways, the project strikes a balance between economic growth, environmental stewardship, and community well-being, reimagining the site as a climate-adapted, forward-thinking modern city. Importantly here, this is a project being led by us as landscape architects with a whole team of urban designers, architects, engineers, right? But as landscape architects, we're able to offer that glue, that mindset of how to integrate these things in a complicated site like this. The second project I want to share with you is Dealey Plaza and Martyrs Park in Dallas, Texas, in the middle of the U.S., a place that connects important public spaces of memory and celebration. Importantly, though, through and across 20th century infrastructure, with new landscapes and green infrastructure of and for remembrance. This is a site, as you can see from the image, that has a lot of freeway and railway infrastructure. And as you'll see, it's a site that's been choked off by these infrastructure developments over time. The site that you saw is right here. This is what used to be the setting. The Trinity River used to come right up to the foot of downtown, but a series of devastating floods at the beginning of the 20th century convinced planners to move this river about a mile away from this location and to begin to redevelop this area. You can see some of the old rail lines there. This is the construction of what's called the triple underpass to carry rail lines above and roadway and highway vehicular lines below. This has been a site of transformation for many, many years. It's also the site, Dealey Plaza, where in 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated right at this spot here from an assassin's bullet coming from that building. And so this space is now a National Park Service site of remembrance. But it's also a project that brings in the enhancement of a second park, the proposed Martyrs Park, a site nearby that was the site of a lynching of 3 innocent black men. This is the current day of the project. You can see the extent of the infrastructure, roadways, railways that really frame the site. These are my 2 collaborators, Monica Ponce de Leon, who's dean at Princeton University School of Architecture, and Mark Lamster. But you can see the railways, the roadways, the traffic that really mar this site of remembrance. That video was taken from this location right near the place that President Kennedy was shot. This is Dealey Plaza. These are those railways. This is the site of the old river. This is Martyrs Park, a little park that's really just inaccessible because of all the roadway infrastructure around it. And then you get a sense of all the highways, freeways, and off-ramps that really choke the site here. And this is the proposal, an idea of really connecting those sites through new kinds of landscape and people-oriented infrastructure that bring us up and over some of the old infrastructure, wrap around to connect the one site to the other, and close down certain roadways, both to offer space for remembrance and also to begin to think of this as an enhanced urban pedestrian-oriented district. Here you can see very quickly the set of strategies, the 2 spaces separated by the triple underpass, the tangle of roadways, railways, and freeways that choke those sites, the idea of connecting up and over and back around, and creating a space for reflection, hovering over the tracks in the middle, and then again, by shutting down one of those roadways, opportunities for connection, reflection, and remembrance. The site sequentially has a series of moments. As you come around the site, you start to ascend. There's a small gathering space for orientation, for initial reflection. A pedestrian is then drawn up to the top of the site over the tracks, where they're given a perch to look back at the place where Kennedy was shot here, the building from which the bullet came and the general environs of the space that these events happened. A quieter place removed from what was going on, but one that finally gives an opportunity for taking it all in safely and quietly. And then one can continue around the back through a series of existing trees, down and around to the memorial, the proposed memorial, not by us, to the martyrs that were lynched in the other space. So really using forms of landscape infrastructure to overcome the barriers of existing roadway and railway infrastructure, and even to create new spaces like this in the center that hover above everything and just offer moments for quiet reflection, or even for release, for kids to just run around and have a moment to themselves. Even here, the way in which the infrastructure is designed draws on some of the old leaning trees and riverboat operations as a way to begin to think about structure. It's also a way in which we're starting to plant trees that are crooked, an indication that something is wrong in this place, something bad happened here, right? But the wonderful thing about trees is they will start to grow up to the light and straighten themselves off. So this nice little subtle moment of poetry, really, of a landscape recovering from a starting point that was a bit unusual. And then finally, these bubbling water features, marking those spots where the bullet hit the president as a very subtle remembrance and maybe sign of hope for water that's constantly breathing new life into the space. All of this is woven together and back to the Trinity River via an extensive forest planting that cools the city, manages and cleans stormwater, provides a visual, sound, and pollution buffer to the surrounding roadways and freeways. A site reimagined to better engage its multiple, sometimes troubled histories, and to provide a new kind of forum for remembrance and civic discourse. And then finally, resilient Moakley Park in my hometown of Boston, Massachusetts, a plan that transforms one of Boston's largest waterfront open spaces from largely a single-use recreational facility into a resilient and multifunctional 21st century community park. It's a space that's accessible by public transportation, and within 15 minutes of a diverse set of neighborhoods, Moakley is poised to be an unprecedented park for these adjacent communities and for all of Boston, one that provides safe and equitable access to high-quality waterfront open space, community resources, as well as athletics and events for all ages, abilities, and backgrounds. But the plan at its heart addresses the city's most pressing climate justice issues, including stormwater management, urban heat island effect, and coastal flooding. In fact, here, the coastal flooding, which initiated the project, is designed to protect the park and surrounding neighborhood and infrastructure from a predicted sea level rise of 21 to 40 inches, just above 1 meter, in the next 50 to 60 years. And while residents understood the need for this forward thinking, they were also talking to us about the ways in which many of the sports fields on the site flooded now from stormwater, right, on a very, very regular basis, which makes sense when you look at the history of this space. This was filled land. Originally, the space was mudflat and tidal marsh here. Somewhere at the early 20th century, that site was filled and flattened. It was used alternately as a garbage dump, a public playground, and eventually a sports and recreation park. It also has a very let's say, active and vivid social history connected to the social movements in the city at the time. Looking forward, though, we're looking at creating a dynamic and adaptive park, one in tune with the environment and that creates a better community space for people who live nearby and a better destination space for those across the city. This is the coastal park section of the project, the part that's really designed to deal with coastal flooding. This blue line is a flood wall embedded into a landscape berm that allows us to create a topography here that can be flooded over time, and that for us then allows for the development of this incredibly rich new dynamic coastal park experience. Here's an animation of what happens. This is a kind of normal day at the park. You can see the water here, occasional flooding events that slowly make their way into the space, park spaces that are designed for the capture of rainwater, but as those rising seas continue to rise during a storm, you can see how the park is really designed to hold and capture that water and keep that water behind the raised berm and embedded flood wall here. This is what that space looks like. So no longer are we thinking of hard concrete walls. We're thinking of dynamic landscape spaces that can help us deal with the challenges of flood control and sea level rise. In this case, offering this new kind of coastal landscape experience in the heart of a park, really centered on people and spaces for collective gathering. This is the existing condition looking back out. The coastal park is here. Not only do we have these projections for sea level rise, there's a lot of stormwater flooding, and the park is redesigned, limits coastal flooding to the front part of the park, and has a series of other stormwater basins and gardens, green infrastructure scattered throughout the park to deal with stormwater flooding as well. This is an amphitheater at the heart of the coastal park, one that's designed for multifunctionality. So here you see it on an everyday. Here you see it being used for an event. Here you see it as part of that occasional storm surge in the future. And then the idea is that when that water recedes, it goes back to the day-to-day activity it can host. In other parts of the park, along the city edge, walking spaces, promenades, dotted with different kinds of gathering spaces for different ages of people from the community, whether it's elders, kids, or teenagers. At the heart of the park, throughout the middle, a series of active sports fields to really retain that characteristic as a sports destination, now resituated with incredible views out to the harbor. And then overall a park that takes a pretty underutilized space that's monofunctional, that has flooding problems, et cetera, and really translates that or transforms that into a multifunctional climate-adapted space that's really better adapted to the current needs of people. Again, coastal flood management, urban heat island effect, stormwater management, reduction or increase of urban biodiversity, all together working toward one goal. A dramatic, multifunctional, active, biodiverse destination park better suited to the harborfront and neighborhood setting, poised to take on the most challenging effects of climate change in a rapidly evolving city. These projects and others like them offer a different way of thinking, a different way of reimagining the infrastructure and underutilized public realm of cities from generations past, transforming sites into living, breathing, pulsing, active, and dynamic public landscapes and green infrastructure. No longer do we need to be constrained by the hard, monofunctional, single-minded, inflexible, and often defensive infrastructure of the past. Here we imagine new kinds of socially, culturally, and environmentally rich spaces, better tuned to the changing climate, better able to respond to the very contemporary demands and desires for what city living and civic life should be. These are cities and public landscapes enriched and revitalized and repositioned for today, for tomorrow, and for the century ahead. Many thanks.
Muchas gracias, Chris. Tenemos un poco de tiempo para hacer algunas preguntas.
In my bag.
Si no os importa, formuláis las preguntas en español, así se traducen directamente, ¿vale?
Perfect.
Interesante ponencia llena y rica de proyectos, ¿no? ¿Tenemos alguna pregunta, alguna cuestión?
Sí, hola. Me ha interesado mucho varios de los proyectos que has puesto y sobre todo me interesa cómo este cambio de paradigma que expone acerca de infraestructuras más resilientes e introducir el dinamismo en la ciudad ecológico, cómo se han desarrollado realmente estos proyectos, porque me imagino que habría reticencias respecto a algunos administradores de las infraestructuras, especialmente viarias, y me refiero sobre todo, poniéndome en el caso de A Coruña, cuando, por ejemplo, en los espacios portuarios sabemos que hay infraestructuras o viarios que penetran en la ciudad, que están diseñados bajo otras lógicas y que, por experiencia, hoy en día lo estamos viendo en Alfonso Molina, seguramente vaya a haber ciertas discrepancias con las administraciones responsables de las infraestructuras.
Yeah, that's a terrific question in many ways. And our job as practitioners is to really help forge a way forward, right? That's where I'm no longer an academic. I'm in practice thinking through with clients on real sites and real projects. How do we do these things, right? Often it takes an incredibly important and experienced and multidisciplinary team on our side, with the same kinds of engineering experts, zoning and code experts, regulatory experts, financial experts that any other team may have. But in this case, our job is to demonstrate to clients, municipalities, bureaucratic leaders, administrative leaders, how the projects still function in the ways they expect them to function and that they need to function from a traffic transport standpoint, for instance, and yet can also do it in a way that looks like something different than they had imagined, right? And so part of that just takes a lot of patient conversation. It often takes the expert, the engineer, explaining the project to the client's engineer, not me, right? So that they're talking engineer to engineer, and they're able to talk in a way that says, no, this is performing in the way that you would expect, right? It's meeting all the same criteria that you're asking the project to meet, and yet we're transforming it. We're making it multifunctional, right? That doesn't make it easier. It just makes it a longer set of conversations about those. Sometimes there's a little give or take on some of those. Sometimes there are pieces of infrastructure, for instance, that are just too hard to move, right? And so the question is, how do you work around them, right, to create some of the, or to realize some of those same goals and ambitions? But I would say it takes a lot of patient conversation, iterative thinking, because for us, there's no one best solution to these problems, right? There may be multiple variations that we can test and show and get to an answer that's going to be workable for everyone. In that last project, for instance, Mockley Park, it wasn't our desire to put a flood wall inside the berm in this landscape, right? Because a lot of us think the landscape and the berm itself can do all the work, but the regulators still want to see a wall, right? So the compromise there is build the wall anyway, cover it with the landscape. It does the thing that we want it to do, and it makes the regulators less nervous because it incorporates the wall, right? So we can find really healthy compromises like that. Other questions?
Hola, buenas. Me ha gustado mucho tu presentación y me gustó mucho un concepto que dijiste sobre reimaginar paisajes. En el caso concreto de A Coruña, vemos que hay una discusión sobre el espacio público, pues de qué manera podemos incorporar la participación pública de forma que se pueda aportar ideas o lo que se proyecte. ¿Nos podrías dar algún ejemplo de los proyectos que has presentado que pueda ilustrar de qué forma podemos incorporar a la población para que se encuentren dentro de las ideas que se proponen?
Yes, certainly. Most of the work that we do in the United States involves extensive public process. So again, that last project, Mockley Park, I think in the first 5 years of that project, we had over 27,000 touch points with different people along the process. So that could be they filled out a survey, or they came to a public event, or they went online, or they did an interview, or we went to a different kind of public event and they showed up at our table and drew a picture or something like that. So first of all, the idea that there are multiple ways and times that we can engage the public, really, really important. We also did this wonderful event at the park where we staged a whole set of activities. There were a whole number of partners involved, organizations that helped out. They closed the road between the park and the beach for the first time, because part of our whole idea was how do we connect the park to the beach and the waterfront. And in doing that, they staged a whole series of activities for kids and others, which really attracted lots of people. And suddenly people were walking across the street in their bathing suits from the beach to get food or a beer in the park, right? Things that had never happened before. And so those kinds of real on-site moments are really great demonstrations of what can happen when you start to temporarily think about, do we close a road? How do we make a connection? How do we begin to use program to attract people? One of the things we also do, for us, it's not a pro forma set of events and activities. We're quite deliberate about recording very carefully the input that we get, and then figuring out how is it that we translate that into the programming and design at the park. At the beginning of that project, I showed you a picture of the fields that were flooding. That was the first thing we learned, is everybody was on board with the coastal protection, but they said that's not our problem today. Our problem today is about we can't use the fields because they flood too much, right? And it shifted our thinking and our attention to, we also need to be thinking about these shorter term issues. It happens to be a site, because it only has sports fields, it's not very active at other times of day. is used by populations who sometimes will leave needles and other things around. So mothers across the street told us they don't want their kid in the park because it's unsafe, right? And so that spawned the city and a partner to start monthly cleanup activities where volunteers would go around the park and clean up detritus, needles, anything that was unsafe or dirty within the park, to show a level of care, right, that would start to make mothers more comfortable about getting their kids back into the park. And then there are other pieces of advice they gave us on program or activity, or one guy said, you know, I just want one really, really, really good baseball park here, which is really good advice, right? Because they have a bunch of crappy baseball fields. And so we made him one really, really, really good baseball park, right? Overall, the number of baseball fields has shrunk. But by building a really good one, by lighting it so it can be played at night, and in combination with the other fields, we've actually extended the usability of that park and those athletic facilities over what they're usable now. So in that sense, I think a public process is essential, right? It allows us to understand what the community is thinking about in a way that maybe is not evident to us or even to a client, right? Can inform ways of going about things, the cleanup activity, just as an easy first step to gain confidence, right? And then long term, what are the important things to the community that are important in terms of programming and design? How can we use that in a really good way? And I want to distinguish that then from saying it's designed by community. It's not. We're still designing it, right? But we're taking this feedback, and with all the other demands that we have on the project, trying to find a way to integrate and synthesize all those uses in order to essentially make the park responsive to the broadest number of people. Because if somebody comes to a meeting and says, hey, I'd love to see this, and suddenly the next time around, we quote them and say, hey, that thing you were talking about is here. It's not necessarily the thing that they had imagined, but it's responded to them. They then own that project. It's theirs. They see themselves reflected in it. And it's how community engagement can be really, really essential to building good constituencies and support for a project.
Muchas gracias por la ponencia. Quería preguntarle dicho grosso modo, de hacer las cosas bien o hacerlas mal, ¿no? Hacer sistemas flexibles, dinámicos, naturalizados, socialmente aceptables, hacerlos rígidos, estáticos. ¿Qué diferencia tenemos en los costes? Porque muchas veces el regulador... el coste es un factor muy importante. ¿Cuál es la dinámica de costes con respecto a hacerlo, entre comillas, bien o mal?
Yeah. So when we think about cost and investment, right, it's not just a hard, soft question. So I can point to some of the coastal areas and promenades here that are actually quite hard, right? They're not the same sort of soft landscape that we're proposing, but are really, really high quality public spaces along the waterfront that attract a lot of people. So even in my short visit, I've seen lots of people running, jogging, using the edge of the water to go swimming, right? It becomes a dynamic social space. And depending on the time of day, it's busier or less busy, that sort of thing, right? So it's not so much in that space, in that sense, a hard space, which is multifunctional, is designed to be dynamic and adaptive too. In terms of, are these things more expensive, less expensive than just doing the flood wall? Well, yeah, typically they're going to be more expensive, right? But the benefit is much bigger, right? The public benefit is huge, right? I'm always amazed with European towns, the extent to which they've buried vehicular infrastructure, whether it's a 9-story underground car park, a tunnel under the city so they're not wiping out a whole historic part of the city, the idea of converting roadways along the waterfront to pedestrian spaces, right? This is something you see a lot in European cities, even multifunctional streets, the street that's right along the harbor in the center of town is a multifunctional street, slow traffic, open to pedestrians, right? These sorts of things are really good. Sometimes they're more expensive, right? But there's a benefit to it. There's a social benefit, there's an environmental benefit, there's a benefit to quality of life, right? There are all those benefits, which are good. Sometimes they're a little hard to quantify. They're obvious, right? In terms of the number of people that are utilizing those. But oftentimes they also have an economic benefit in terms of attracting people to town, right? So visitors to town, you may get more visitors because it's just a more beautiful space. They're spending money in the city, which has a benefit to both local businesses and eventually to the government itself. These are projects that also attract new development interest. Anytime you make an investment in open space, the land immediately next door goes up in value, right? And a municipality can, particularly in the US, the way the law and taxes work is an increase in property value can be captured. That increase goes back to the city for reinvestment in some of the infrastructure in that district or across the city, right? And so we typically have economic development consultants on projects like this who aren't just helping us think about the costs, but they're thinking about investment opportunity, return on investment, alternate financing and funding scenarios, right? In Moakley Park, we told the client, it's better for you to go big than to go modest, because if you go big, you're going to attract interest from philanthropic foundations, say, that want to help to do something big. They wouldn't be interested if you were just doing something modest and small, right? And so right now we're working with an economic development firm to think about new forms of governance, right? Funding, financing mechanisms with the city, partnerships with the city that will actually grow the economic opportunity of the project. So even though the project's more expensive, the return on that investment's going to be much bigger than if you were to do it a simpler, cheaper way. And I think that's the message.
Bueno, muchas gracias por su presentación y me gustaría, simplemente añadir y como complemento de todas las preguntas que se han dado, incluir el factor tiempo. ¿Cuánto se tarda, ¿no? ¿Cuál es el proceso de construcción y de llevar a buen puerto uno de estos proyectos, ¿no? Un proceso razonable, un tiempo razonable que también nosotros podemos aprender para poder aplicar en Coruña.
Yeah, these are big projects that take a lot of time. They take time because they're complicated, right? They're complicated physically. They're complicated from a regulatory standpoint. A project like this in the port is complicated from an ownership standpoint, right? It's also complicated from the standpoint of who might have a lease on a site or a portion of the site, right? What's the expiration of those leases? You need to kind of factor that in. And then there's just the whole construction logistics piece and availability of funds, right? So all these things get factored in to how to do these projects. Projects like some of the ones I'm showing are real generational transformative projects. You don't want them to go fast, right? They may take 10, 12 years to be fully realized, but their effect is for 50 and 100 years. And so rushing it's not going to get a better solution. It's going to get a solution that you may have to kind of fix over time. I think it's hard to know, for instance, with your project at the port, what lies underground is always important, right? Where are there utilities that we don't know about? Where is there potentially contaminated land that we don't know about, that we have to work with and work around? These are typical things, right? But until we clearly identify them and then clearly identify, say there's contamination somewhere. We even have contamination in the park. Is that safe enough to leave in place and to cap? Or does that have to be removed to an off-site facility? What are the costs for doing that? And those sorts of things take time and careful planning to decide. It's just one issue, right? They're regulatory issues. It's going to take years to get the flood berm permitted, for instance. And so 10, 12 years is a good starting point to see full transformative change, right? But there are parts of the project that may continue to go from there. I think the important part is to make the proper investments in design and planning first, right? Start to work through the logistics of engineering and implementation. Start to make those big investments in the new infrastructure. How do you reroute traffic? How do you begin to develop the new critical spines of open space, right, as the critical infrastructure? And then typically open it up to the private sector to come in for very specific development projects that can begin to help build out the project and generate the kind of return on investment that you want. So it will be staged. It will take time, right? But one of the things we're also interested in is how can you make the interim time active and exciting for people? Are there parts of the site that can be opened up, that can be staged in temporary ways for festivals or public access, right? Is there a day like I described at Moakley Park where a roadway is shut down and suddenly the general public has access to a space that they've never had access before, and they suddenly see the potential and excitement of a project, right? There are many things you can do in the interim while things are being planned, designed, and initially constructed to generate some activity and momentum for the project over time.
Bueno, pues una última pregunta que te voy a formular yo, ¿no? Situar el paisaje como recurso básico del diseño urbano, ¿no? Fue un revulsivo a nivel académico en Harvard, ¿no? En el año 2006, ¿no? Ahí apareció el urbanismo del paisaje, el urbanismo ecológico, el urbanismo de procesos en los países nórdicos, en España el urbanismo ecosistémico, ¿no? Todos estos movimientos, ¿no?, que han ido apareciendo con mayor o menor fortalezas y debilidades, nos sitúan ahora mismo en dónde, ¿no? ¿Cuál es el punto de reflexión ex novo, ¿no?, en el año 2025 o en los últimos años, ¿no?
Yeah, I think we're at a critical moment when it comes to global issues of climate change, for instance, that go far beyond any one city, any one nationality, right? How is it that individually and collectively we can take on some of these bigger challenges? More and more, I think these issues are pressing on us, and in some ways we need to find ways in on any kind of project to address these issues. There are many good movements, biophilia, we were talking about before. Each of them have different ways into thinking about the natural environment, biology, ecology, the ways in which lessons from science and the natural world can begin to be infused into thinking about cities, right, as we begin to move toward the future. I think we're at a good point. I think we've had experience now since the 1990s, early 2000s that show how landscape projects across the world can be absolutely transformative, right? Early on, I showed a project in Toronto at the mouth of the Don River. That was a design competition. We lost that design competition, but the winning firm just implemented the rerouting of that river and the beginning of the development of some of those new neighborhoods. So the ideas were similar, and they're now being built out, right? And so we have really good evidence, projects like that, projects across Europe. You look at the Highline project in New York City, a landscape-based project and an old piece of infrastructure that has transformed that area of Manhattan, right? Socially rich, culturally rich, and new kinds of economic investments across the board. So we have the evidence now that these kinds of strategies work, right? They work socially, culturally. They add to cities. They don't take things away. I think now the challenge is using our very latest thinking on science, biology, ecology, environmentalism. How is it that we continue to push these ideas and think about them not only from a science technological standpoint, but just from the standpoint of human health and well-being, right? The idea that any kid, any elder can go into a space that's lush and green and simply just feel better, right? Feel cooler, interact with nature, you know, take our heart rate down a couple steps, right? Those kinds of moments are special, and the fact that you can have that in the center of a vibrant, thriving city, I think is really the great potential for all of us as we move forward.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, creo que lo dejamos aquí. Muchas gracias, Chris, por tu conocimiento, reflexiones y generosidad. Un gran aplauso.